In this course, we have moved solidly from the planning phase. Now we are moving into the analysis phase. And if I had to sum up analysis in one word, it's understanding. So in the analysis phase, we're trying to understand this new system that we're developing. We're trying not only that, we're trying to understand the existing system. We're trying to know how it works. We're going to try to understand how the users use that system. Right? So this unit is all about starting to try to understand what the needs are, what the current system does, what the current workflow looks like, and I'll talk about some techniques that we can use to do that. But before I get into that, this is just an example of of kind of how I look at this topic. We're really going to rely on users to tell us about a system or to tell us how they use a system or how systems work. We have to use these different techniques I'm going to talk about. But at the end of the day, they all come down to relying on humans that are currently using that system to help us give us an understanding of what the needs are and how things work. And one of the important things that you have to remember is that as a systems analyst, you have to constantly try to understand not only what you're trying to do, but also you have to understand what the question is, right? So here, we're trying to solve a problem, right? That's basically what an analyst is doing. We are trying to solve a problem. But before we can solve a problem, we have to understand the question. And I tell my kids this sometimes when they're doing their homework. Take a look at this problem that I have from this is just a second grade or third grade math problem. Or maybe it's first grade, I don't even remember, but whatever, it's a rudimentary math problem. But this is a word problem. And if you read that word problem, right, so as I'm talking, maybe take a look at that word problem. And what I want you to think about is what is the question that they're asking in that word problem, right? And this, if you were a kid learning how to do word problems, that's what you would have to ask yourself is what is the actual question here? What are they asking me to do, right? So the user is telling us that Sally and Joey are working on a report and they're at the library. They have all the books on two subjects. They have 54 books altogether. So which two subjects are they working with? Well, that's a lot of words for somebody to say which two numbers add up to 54, right? In that list, which two numbers add up to 54? That's it. That's the question. That's a really easy way to ask that question, but that's not really going to work that way in the real world, right? So when we're working on these projects, when we're trying to understand the problem, first we have to try to understand the question. Here's another example. This is probably not a real example, but there's an old story, and I'm sure this story's been debunked, but this is an old story where a guy calls up Pontiac in 1971 and he says, I bought this car, and every time I go to the grocery store and I buy vanilla ice cream, the car won't start. If I buy chocolate ice cream, strawberry ice cream, any other flavor ice cream, the car starts no problem, but vanilla, car won't start. So, of course, if you worked at Pontiac and somebody called you and told you that, you would probably think they're nuts, right? What the heck does ice cream have to do with the car starting? It doesn't make any sense. If you were a mechanic and somebody came in and complained to you about that, you would think they're crazy. So somebody from Pontiac, this guy keeps calling, and somebody from Pontiac goes out and they observe what he does, right? They observe what happens every day and they start taking notes. And after they start taking notes, they start to see a pattern. They see that each time they go to the grocery store and buy vanilla ice cream, it takes far less time for them to go into the store and come back out of the store with the ice cream and try to start the car. And of course, it doesn't start. When they buy other flavors, it ends up taking a lot more time. So there's a pattern that they start to recognize. Now it's starting to make a little more sense, right? So then the engineer figures out that vanilla ice cream is stocked in the front of the store to make it easy for customers to come in and buy ice cream, for the common flavors. But all the other flavors are stored in the back, the back corner of the store. It seems like they always put ice cream in the furthest corner of the store, so it takes a long time to get it. So now it's making even more sense, right? So now the real question is, the real problem statement is, when I try to start my car after having shut it off just a few minutes before, it won't start. But if I let the car sit for a longer period of time, the car starts. And what you're describing there is vapor lock. It's a common it was a common problem in older cars back in the 70s. That was pretty common. But now the problem makes a lot more sense, right? So the problem is our users are never going to tell us that the car won't start because it's been sitting for only a minute versus, been sitting, for a longer period of time. Instead, they're always going to tell us that our problem is vanilla ice cream. And our job as analysts is to get past the ice cream. We have to figure out that the real problem is that the car is trying to be started too soon. So that's what we discuss in this unit in determining system requirements. So I'm going to talk about these topics in this unit. You can pause the video if you want to take a look at those in more detail. But we are in the analysis phase. We've already completed the planning phase, so now we are in that analysis phase. So the process for determining requirements, a good systems analyst that's good at determining what these requirements are is going to have a few traits. One of them is going to be impertinence. This is sort of like if you have children and they say, "Why is the sky blue?" or "Why is the sky blue?" and you say, "Because water is blue." Well, why is water blue? Right? It never ends. Right? They keep asking questions because they're trying to understand. They don't understand the world around them. It's the only way they can do that. That's a textbook definition of impertinence, and that's how we want to be as analysts. We want to be constantly asking questions. We're trying to get to the lowest common denominator, trying to get as much information as we can. We want to have impartiality, so we want it to be unbiased, right? We want to try to consider all of the different options and what's best for the organization, and not what's best for us or what's best for the team or best technical solution or what's the most fun to work with, right? We want to try to be impartial. We want to relax constraints, meaning that we can assume that anything is possible. Let's pretend that technology doesn't matter, right? When we're in this requirements determining phase, let's pretend the technology is we can have anything we want in a perfect world. How would this work in a perfect world, right? And what can we do to get there? A lot of people will skip that step and say, well, we know that the technology can't support this. Let's go right to this other option. But maybe there is a way to make that happen. Maybe there's a way to think outside the box. You want to have good attention to detail, be able to reframe, challenge yourself to think in different ways. Think about the problem in different ways, right? So these are some of the techniques that you would have if you're a good analyst, or some of the attributes, rather, you might have if you're a good analyst. So the business objectives that drive what and how work is done. So these are things we're trying to understand. Information that people need to do their jobs. We want to try to determine the data that's being used throughout the process, how it's moved to transformed and stored, any dependencies or sequences that happen with that data, any business rules and how they handle that data or how they handle a process, any policies or guidelines throughout the process, key events. These are all the things that we're going to try to look for in our requirements determining phases. All right, so the deliverables for the requirements determination is going to be basically from our interviews, observations, and transcripts and so forth, any existing written documentation and so forth, anything from computerized sources. All of these things we're going to gather together. And this basically are these are basically the traditional methods for gathering information about solving the problem or analyzing the problem. So there are really three primary methods to do requirements gathering, three traditional methods. There's interviewing individuals, interviewing groups, observing workers, and studying business documents. I consider the first two to be the same, right? Interview, so basically there's interviews, observation, and studying artifacts. I call the last one artifacts, but your book calls it business documents. So this is where we look at things that can give us information. We can observe, so we can watch how people do things. We can interview to ask them directly how they do things. So interviewing is probably the first thing and one of the primary ways that we're going to gather information. This is kind of our first step into trying to determine the requirements. So an interview guide is basically a document that we use for developing, planning, and conducting that interview. So basically, if we're going to conduct an interview, you want to plan ahead. Make sure that you prepare the interviewees, know what you're going to ask them about. Maybe give them any priming questions ahead of time so that they're prepared. Maybe they need to gather additional information for you. You're going to have an agenda so they know, kind of what to expect, what you're going to be asking. That checklist is also going to keep you on track so that you're not going off in different tangents, right? And sometimes people will hijack your interviews, right? You start asking questions and they try to take it in a completely different direction. And in order to keep these interviews objective, we want to make sure if we're interviewing multiple people, we're asking them the same questions to try to drive at the same information, right? So we don't want to try to let people hijack our interview. Sometimes it can be good to get that additional information, but sometimes you want to make sure that you're staying on task. We're going to listen carefully and take notes. If you're allowed, you can tape record it. I always tell people to make sure you ask before you record. In certain states, you're actually not allowed to. It's against the law to record without asking someone first, so it's something to be careful of. And once you're done, you want to review those notes within 48 hours because you're going to forget, and that happens to me all the time. I'll go into I'll work with a customer and I'll do some kind of an interview with them, and I'll forget everything that we talked about. So you want to make sure that you take some notes and that you review those within 48 hours, and you give yourself some better notes later on, right? You're going to take shorthand probably in an interview, so you want to kind of distill that into something you can make sense of later. And of course, you want to be neutral. You don't want to indicate whether or not you agree or disagree with the interviewee, right? You want to try to be impartial, as we discussed before, and seek diverse views. So interview lots of different kinds of people. And this is just an example of an interview guide from your textbook. I'm not going to waste too much time showing you the details here. As far as interview questions, there are really two main types of interview questions. You have open-ended and closed-ended. Open-ended would be where you ask a question and wait for a response, and closed-ended would be where you give a list of possible responses. So closed-ended would be a little bit like like a multiple choice test, and open-ended would be more like an essay question on a test. And they both have their good and their bad points, right? Open-ended questions are great because you can get lots of additional information that you weren't expecting. You give people a chance to talk about things in more detail. But they can also be bad because, again, people can go off in different tangents. They might give you information you really don't need that you have to wade through. I can tell you as a teacher that grading essay tests are much more difficult than grading multiple choice, right? Because multiple choice, there's only one right answer. And, of course, with these interviews, the closed-ended are good because it allows you to get more objective feedback because you can compare what everyone, there's these clear answers that you can compare. You can say, okay, 50% of the people said A, 25% B, and 25% said C, right? So then you can see that A is the overwhelming majority in that case, where that might not be as clear with an open-ended question. Closed-ended questions can be bad because what if what if the user doesn't like any of those options and you don't give them another option? That could present bias when you didn't intend to have bias. Good example of that is I get these emails sometimes, these political emails. Lately I get them from the Trump administration, and they say, please take this survey and tell us how Donald Trump is doing. And my options are Donald Trump is doing fantastic, excellent, or good, right? But what if I think he's not doing good? Well, that's not an answer, right? So then people take this poll and then they come back and say, hey, guess what? 90% of Americans think that Donald Trump's doing a good job, but what they don't tell you is that there was no other option, right? So that could certainly present some bias in the process. All right, so don't phrase a question in a way that implies a right or a wrong answer. Again, we're going to make sure we listen very carefully. We're going to take our notes and review them within 48 hours after the interview so we don't forget, so we can distill that into something we can use later on. Don't set expectations about the new system unless you know these will be deliverables later on. So it's important not to get into the trap where you start talking about what the new system is going to do. Say, oh, yeah, our new system is going to do X, Y, and Z in the interview, and then but you haven't even made those decisions yet, right? So it's not a good idea to do that. And again, we want to seek a variety of perspectives from these interviews. You can also interview groups. One of the drawbacks to interviews, to individual interviews, is you can get contradictions and inconsistencies if everyone's not in the same room. And then you have to do follow-up discussions to try to figure out, what's the right answer. But and they may even you reveal even new questions and things that now you have to go back and do the interviews again, right? However, with groups, if you interview several key people together, it's going to be a better effect or a more effective use of their time. You can hear them argue with each other about what's correct and hear them come to a consensus. So it kind of does the work for you because they come forward to a consensus for you if they're all answering the question together. It gives you an opportunity to see how they work together. Some of the disadvantages is that it's very difficult to schedule these interviews because everyone's got busy schedules. So that can certainly make it difficult. So you might be stuck. But I will tell you that we've got a lot of newer technologies now that we can do interviews now on things like WebEx and GoToMeeting. We could do them online. And it is nice to see people when you're doing these types of meetings, if you can see them face to face as opposed to just over a telephone. But again, we do have some technology to help us do that. So the nominal group technique, or NGT, is a facilitated process that supports the idea that supports idea generation by groups. Basically, when you get a lot of people together and you start discussing things as a group, basically this is what you do. Each person is going to, and you've probably done this in college classes, right? You go into a class and the instructor is going to say, okay, I want everybody to break up into small groups. You're going to discuss this topic, and you're going to brainstorm some answer to this discussion. Then everybody comes back and you write down each group's consensus, and then as a group you discuss everything. And that's basically what NGT is. So that's the basic concept. The other thing about NGT is when you get a group together like this, you may even be able to discover new ways of doing things. You can discover, kind of different techniques and so forth and so on. So it's definitely a good technique. We're going to talk more about that later on too when we talk about the JAD technique. All right, the next thing we can do after interviews, the next option is going to be direct observation. This is where we watch users doing their job. It's going to be used to obtain first-hand objective measure of how the employee interacts with the system. So in interviews, they tell us how they use the system, or they tell us how that they do their job, or how the workflow works. And then in observations, we actually watch the process, right? One of the things, the problems with observation is when someone's being observed, they tend to behave very differently. So that's another issue, is people will behave differently when we're observing them, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to try to minimize that. Observations are very time-consuming too. It takes a long time. You got to go out, you got to sit there for a couple hours, and you have to observe what happens. And one of the problems with observations is sometimes if you don't observe long enough, you miss some of the exceptions and things that don't happen often. So you can miss things if you're not observing long enough. All right, so the other option we have for gathering information is going to be looking at artifacts. So document analysis is what your book calls this, where you can review existing business documents. It can give you a historical or formal view of the system requirements, how it was designed in the past or how it's intended to work. So types of information that could be discovered is problems with the existing systems, opportunities to meet new needs, organizational direction. Names of key individuals will certainly be drummed up here, and values of the organization, right? Special information processing circumstances, reasons for the current system design, and various rules for processing data. Business rules will generally be codified into these documents that we look at, things like standard operating procedures. And that's what a written work procedure is, right? So in your book, they talk about a written work procedure. What they're really talking about is a SOP, or a standard operating procedure. They describe how a particular task is performed. So if somebody works for a company and they're going to perform a task and they don't know how to do it, if there's a SOP, it will tell them how to do it. It will say, here is how you're going to do this specific task, and it'll lay it out step by step. So it might look something like this. All right, so some potential problems with the procedure documents is they may involve duplication of effort because you've already looked at all this stuff. They may be missing procedures that have been developed over time. They could be out of date because they don't get updated. Nobody ever likes to update documentation, so that could be a problem. They may contradict information that's been obtained through interviews because maybe they do things different than what's in the documentation. Basically, documentation is formal systems. So formal systems is the way the system is supposed to officially work, right? Where informal systems is how the system actually works, which may not be the same, right? So your interviews and your observations are going to show you informal systems, the way that the system actually works or has evolved to work over time. Whereas looking at these, doing this document analysis is going to show you the formal systems or how it's supposed to work. So the other thing we could look at is business forms. So forms will describe input to our system. So it's used for all types of functions, and it's going to tell you about data that's coming into our system and what those data points are. And here's an example of a form. This is an invoice, right? So this would give us a lot of insight. Obviously, an invoicing system is pretty obvious. You need to know about the customer. You need to know about the products that are being invoiced, right? But business documents that are more complicated can give you a lot of insight into the data points that are required for that system. So this is certainly a good source of information, forms, looking at the different forms. And along with forms, we also have reports which describe the output from our system. So we could also take a look at output reports, which are again going to show us more data points from the system and give us some insight into into what types of data our system is going to need to output, and thus we're going to have to track in our system. All right, this is the matrix from your textbook that compares the observation and document analysis techniques and what you can expect to learn from these. So in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about some of the contemporary methods for determining system requirements beyond the traditional methods that I just talked about.